Hi everyone, Black Widow VR1 here, and today we are going to be reading Asbo fairy tales. It's something that was requested of me, so these are stories for adults and not for children. So let's begin. The first one is called Snow White and the Seven Dads, and it is a more up-to-date version of Snow White. It is Snow White appears at the televised court of King Jeremy, where DNA testing will tell her in the live studio audience whether the dwarf on stage is the father of her child. Once upon a time, there was a wise ruler named King Jeremy. He lived in a great TV studio inside a castle and spent his time listening to the grievances of the common people. Every morning he sat on his golden throne while his subjects unburdened themselves in front of him and his live studio audience. King Jeremy would then pass judgment on the cases that came before him, all of which were broadcast throughout the realm to be heard by the people, except for the ones who had jobs and weren't watching television at 10 a.m. One day a young woman appeared at King Jeremy's court. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. Her name was Snow White, and she brought with her a small child. The king listened kindly to her story, and then he brought her before his live studio audience. "Meet Snow White, ladies and gentlemen," said King Jeremy. "She says that the father of her child won't face up to his responsibilities. Take a seat, Snow White." The townspeople in the king's audience applauded politely. "Now, in the dressing chamber, Snow White," said King Jeremy, "you told my research wench that this all started when your stepmother tried to kill you." The townspeople gasped. "It all started, wise Majesty," said Snow White, "when my father got remarried to my proud and arrogant stepmother. As I grew up, I became ever more beautiful, beautiful even as the light of the sun. One day her magic mirror told her that I was much fitter than she was, and she—" "Hold on," said the king. "Are you telling me on national television that your stepmother had a magic mirror?" "I am, Majesty," said Snow White. "At the end of the day, it basically told her that I was way fitter than she. So she summoned a huntsman to take me out into the woods to kill me, and bring my lungs and liver back so she could feast on them." "Imagine that audience," said King Jeremy, shaking his head slowly to demonstrate his disapproval. "But he didn't kill you, did he? He just pretended to, leaving you instead to wander the forest alone. Alone, until you came across a little house and went inside in order to rest. And according to my researchers, you found a little table with 7 little plates, 7 knives, forks, and 7 mugs as well. And against the wall there were 7 little beds. And to whom did those beds belong, Snow White?" "Dwarfs," said Snow White. "And one of these dwarfs, you say," said the king, "is the child's father?" "Yes, Majesty," said Snow White. "After dark the dwarfs returned home from a day in the mountain digging for gold, to make sovereign rings with. They lit their 7 candles, and as soon as it was light in their house, they saw that I had been there. The first one said, 'Who has been sitting in my chair?' The second one said, 'Who has been smoking my fags?' The third one said, 'Who has been drinking my cider?' The fourth one said, 'Who has smoked all my weed?' The fifth one said, 'Who has eaten all my crisps?' And the sixth one said, 'Who has been sick in my trainers?'" "Why were you sick in his trainers?" asked King Jeremy. "I shouldn't have had the weed after the cider," said Snow White, her eyes cast modestly on the floor. "And the 7th one, the child's father, said nothing at all, because he had been to the pub on the way home, and he fell asleep on the sofa as soon as he got in. Bloody typical." "Bloody typical," King Jeremy repeated, nodding his head wisely. "Carry on, Snow White. I know it takes a lot to sit up here and share this with your king and a live studio audience." "They all said," sniffed Snow White, "that if I keep a house for them, and cook, make beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then I could stay with them, and that I should have everything that I wanted, Majesty." "And thus you became pregnant?" said the king, skillfully moving the story along so not as to run over into the next guest's slot. "Is that everything you wanted?" In the audience, a fairy with an orange face shook her head disapprovingly. "It was a moment of madness," trembled Snow White. "I needed a shoulder to cry on. My mother had just tried to slay me, and I had cider that day." "So what would you say to this dwarf," said the king, "if he were here today, on national television?" "Face your responsibilities," said Snow White, pouting. "Face your responsibilities," bellowed the King Jeremy. Bring him forth from the dungeon, ladies and gentlemen, and keep an open mind here. Please welcome dwarf number 7. A bearded dwarf walked into the king's stage, led by a jailer with a bunch of keys at his waist. Snow White leapt to her feet and struck the dwarf twice before a burly man-at-arms made her sit down again. "Dwarf," said King Jeremy, "according to Snow White, you are the father of her child." "It's a base lie, Majesty," said the dwarf. "She's a slag." "You're going to call the mother of your child a slag?" said the king, waving his arms. "On national television? I beseech you, Majesty." "She is a slag," said the dwarf. "She kept house, cooked, made beds, sewed and knitted for all of us, and the rest of us, believe you me, Majesty, she had 7 dwarfs on the go at once." "You liar," hissed Snow White. "He's definitely the father, Majesty. It was the time my stepmother disguised herself as a peddler woman and tried to suffocate me with an overtight bodice. He found me and loosened the bodice, causing me to breathe again, and little by little to come back to life. And then I needed a shoulder to cry on. Besides, the bodice was already undone by then." "She's done it with all of us, Majesty," said the dwarf. "This one time her stepmother tried to kill her with a poisoned comb, and dwarf number 5 removed the comb from her hair, and little by little brought her back to life, and then she done it with him in the privy." "In the privy!" howled King Jeremy, demonstrating to his audience that this was wrong by pulling an exasperated face. "Me and this one had broken up at this point, Majesty," said Snow White, glaring at the dwarf. "I needed a shoulder to cry on, and I've been drinking cider." "A shoulder to cry on," said King Jeremy. "Let me see what my live studio audience of townspeople think of this." With that, the king stepped down from his throne and handed the microphone to an elf wearing a baseball cap in the front row. "At the end of the day," said the elf, "you've got to have respect." The townspeople cheered and clapped, the king nodded savagely. "Whatever," said the dwarf with an ill-tempered shrug. "At the end of the day—" "Look at you!" shouted King Jeremy. The king quickly checked that the man-at-arms was nearby, then leapt up onto the stage and waved his finger fiercely at the dwarf. "You're a jumped-up layabout who's not fit to be a father, a mischievously foundling," he yelled. "Take a good look at yourself. You're good for nothing but mining precious metal in the mountains. We're talking about a child here, a tiny child. The very sight of you makes me want to spew hot blood. Why this girl is still with you, I don't know." "I'm breaking up with him, King Jeremy," said Snow White, folding her arms. "Stop fucking texting me then," snapped the dwarf. Although the viewers at home did not hear this word because a trumpet was sounded over the swear word. "You keep on texting me too," said Snow White. "You always start it." "Whatever," said the dwarf. "You'll be calling me later today because I'm famous now, if you're not doing it with the other dwarfs, that is." The audience howled, and the milkmaid made an obscene gesture at the dwarf. "Whatever," he mumbled. "She did it with all my mates." "You did it with all his mates," said the king to Snow White, shaking his head again. "How do you respond to that vile accusation?" "I needed a shoulder to cry on," Snow White shrugged, "and I had cider." "Bring them out," shouted the king. The door swung open, and 6 more dwarfs walked in, looking dejected. "I thought we were getting married," one dwarf shouted at Snow White. "I want my CDs back," shouted another. "You didn't even cook and clean," bellowed a third, who sported several gold earrings. "All you did was sit around watching daytime television." One dwarf headbutted another and was restrained by the burly man-at-arms. "You all disgust me," said the king. "I could physically vomit. However, let's settle this once and for all by asking the DNA crystal ball who the father is." A wizened sorcerer appeared on the stage in a swirl of mist, holding a crystal ball. King Jeremy gazed deeply into it, and a deeply hush fell over the townspeople. "The father is," said the king, raising one eyebrow at the audience. The first dwarf inspected his fingernails, while the other dwarfs all glared at each other. "The father is," repeated the king. "Who?" said Snow White excitedly. "None of them," the king said. "Apparently the father is some handsome prince." At this the townspeople roared louder than ever. "I needed a shoulder to cry on," yelled Snow White, looking at the glowering dwarfs, "and I had cider." "After the break," said the weary King Jeremy, "we'll meet Gretchen. She says she's worried sick about her son because he keeps running away from home. He says that she's overprotective because he's made of gingerbread. Don't go away, viewers." And that, my friends, was Snow White and the 7 Dads. Until next time, I am Black Widow. You are awesome. Thank you very much for joining in with Asbo Fairy Tales. Goodbye.